Normandy, July 1944. An American forward observer is looking at a hedgerow he cannot see through. He cannot identify a rifleman. He cannot count a machine gun crew. He cannot point to a helmet, a muzzle, or a face. But he can mark the hedge on a map. That is enough. A fire request goes back. Mortar or artillery rounds begin to fall into a strip of earth where German soldiers may be hidden. One of those soldiers has done almost everything correctly. His helmet is covered. His face is darkened. His camouflage breaks up his outline. He has stayed still beneath roots and leaves for hours. The concealment works. He is still killed. That is the contradiction at the center of the Bocage fighting. German camouflage in Normandy could be extraordinarily effective at defeating human vision. In some sectors, it helped defenders remain unseen long enough to fire first, shift position, or direct mortars onto attacking troops. Yet against American units, being unseen did not always mean being untouched. The reason was not that American soldiers had somehow learned to see through foliage. It was that a growing part of the American fire system did not require a man to be visually identified before the ground around him became a target. To understand why that mattered, begin with what the Germans had actually built. In 1931, the German army introduced a disruptive camouflage pattern known as splitter-tarn-muster or splinter pattern. Hard-edged fields of green and brown broke across a lighter background, crossed by thin vertical marks that suggested falling rain. It first appeared on the triangular shelter quarter carried by German soldiers, but the logic did not remain on canvas for long. By the late 1930s, camouflage had moved onto smocks, helmet covers, and specialist clothing. The Waffen-SS pushed the idea further. One of the central designers was the Munich artist Johann Georg Otto Schick, whose work treated concealment less like painting a soldier green, and more like breaking the visual signals the eye uses to recognize a human body. Oak leaf shapes, plane tree patterns, blurred edges. Reversible garments that could place a greener side outward in one season, and a browner side outward in another. Reports from 1937 field trials were cited as estimating a 15% casualty reduction. Whether every later battlefield result can be reduced to that number is another question. What matters is the design objective. These garments were meant to delay recognition, and in Normandy, the terrain amplified that advantage. The Bocage was not simply a countryside full of bushes. Hedgerows often sat on raised earthen banks, thickened by roots, hawthorn, bramble, and trees. Lanes could sink below the surrounding fields. Visibility collapsed at short range. A position could be dug into the bank itself, with foliage above and earth in front. A machine gun team or observer did not need to disappear forever. It only needed to remain unseen long enough to shoot first or report what it saw. That distinction matters. Camouflage does not have to make a soldier literally invisible to be lethal. It has to delay the enemy's decision. A few seconds can protect the first burst from a machine gun. Half a minute can allow a rifleman to fire and crawl to another position. Several minutes can let an observer pass coordinates to a mortar line before the attacking infantry understands where the fire is coming from. In the fighting around Caen, British troops repeatedly met that problem. German defenses were often arranged so that the most visible part of the position was not the part doing most of the killing. A lightly held forward line could watch the approaches. Mortars and artillery sat farther back. Concealed machine guns covered likely routes. The front soldier's job was not always to win a prolonged rifle duel. Sometimes his real value was to remain hidden, observe movement, and help bring heavier fire onto men who had exposed themselves crossing open ground or climbing a hedge. British formations had enormous artillery power of their own, and their attacks were far more complex than any simple formula of seeing a target and charging it. But many set-piece methods still depended on building a deliberate picture of the enemy position, suppressing it, and then moving infantry against it. In Bocage country, that picture could be late, incomplete, or wrong. A Bren gun team could suppress a known firing point. Riflemen could maneuver against a hedge they believed held Germans. Artillery could be planned onto a mapped objective. The problem arrived when the defender's exact firing point was not where the attacker expected it to be. A German soldier might fire once from a slit in the vegetation, then disappear behind the bank. A machine gun could work from a reverse slope. A forward observer might never show more than a small patch of face before dropping out of view. The camouflage bought time, and the terrain multiplied it. That was the tactical product Germany had created, not invisibility as magic, but uncertainty as a weapon. The Bocage punished anyone who had to solve that uncertainty before firing. The British experience made the effect obvious because so many actions became contests over positive location. An infantry section pinned by a shot from an unseen hedge had to decide whether to move, wait, call, support, or risk crossing ground without knowing where the next burst would come from. The defenders had prepared for that hesitation. Mortars were already registered on likely approaches. Concealed observers were already watching lanes and gaps. The longer an attacking unit remained fixed, the more useful those observers became. This helps explain why contemporary descriptions so often reached for the language of invisibility. The problem was not merely that German uniforms were hard to distinguish from leaves. It was that a defensive system had been built around the time concealment created. Camouflage protected the observer protected the mortar. The mortar punished the infantry that stopped to search. That chain is more important than the pattern printed on any one smock. And it also explains why the same camouflage could produce a different result when it met a different engagement logic. American units entered Normandy with their own weaknesses. They suffered badly in Hedgerow country. They did not possess a magical answer on the first day. And camouflage did not suddenly become useless because an American flag appeared on the other side of a field. But American doctrine carried a habit that attacked the German advantage at an unusual point in the chain. It treated suspicion as actionable. If a hedge, tree line, building, ditch, or bank looked like a place where an enemy could be waiting, the response did not always begin with a scout crawling close enough to prove it. The response could begin with fire. The term was reconnaissance by fire. Its logic was simple. Fire into a likely position. If the enemy reacts, the reaction gives information. If he does not react, the fire may still suppress him, wound him, force him lower, disrupt his observation, or make him abandon the place before friendly troops cross the dangerous ground. The method spent ammunition to buy uncertainty down. That was expensive, it was noisy. It could waste rounds on empty foliage. But against a defense whose advantage depended on remaining undetected until the first shot, wasted bullets were not always wasted effort. They changed who was forced to move first. The weapon that made this habit unusually practical at squad level was the M1 Garand. Adopted before the war, the Garand gave the American rifleman a semi-automatic service rifle at a time when the standard rifles of most other major armies were still manually operated bolt actions. The important point was not a competition over who could shoot fastest on a range. It was what a squad could do when it had to place repeated fire onto a patch of ground without a clearly visible man inside it. With semi-automatic rifles, a Browning automatic rifle, machine guns and vehicle-mounted weapons available around the infantry, an American unit could put a heavy volume of fire into likely hiding places without demanding that every shot be aimed at a confirmed body. A hedge could be fired on because it was dangerous terrain. A window could be fired on because it dominated a street. A tree line could be fired on because movement had been seen there once. A gap could be combed before infantry crossed it. From the German side, this could feel irrational. Imagine a paratrooper from the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division lying beneath the growth east of Saint-Lô. His splinter-patterned smock breaks his outline. His position is deep enough that an approaching rifleman may pass within short range and never see him. He has been trained to wait. The first exposed American should become the first target. Then a Sherman arrives. The tank commander does not identify the German. The bow gunner does not point and shout that he has seen a helmet. The coaxial machine gun simply sweeps the hedge, because a hedge is where a German might be. Branches jump, leaves tear loose, dirt spits from the bank. The hidden man now faces a choice that camouflage was supposed to postpone. Stay absolutely still and trust the rounds to miss, or react and reveal the position. The American fire has already taken part of his advantage away before anyone has actually seen him. This is where the contrast with the German defensive logic becomes clearer. The German system often tried to separate observation from destruction. Keep the observer hard to find, let him report, let mortars and artillery do the killing. Use a concealed machine gun to stop movement at the point where the attacker is most exposed. American reconnaissance by fire attacked the observation layer itself. It cut foliage, it forced heads down, it made observation dangerous even before the observer had been located. It could reveal a muzzle flash, a burst of movement, or a return shot, and even when it revealed nothing, it could make the next few seconds safer for the men who had to move. That did not make American infantry reckless. In fact, German prisoners recorded in wartime interrogation reports complained about almost the opposite. One captured corporal was recorded as saying, "Americans use infantry cautiously. The line sounds like praise until it is placed beside the rest of the battlefield." The prisoners were noticing that American units did not always need to push riflemen forward just to discover what was hiding in front of them. Fire could go first. Infantry could remain under cover while machine guns, mortars, tanks, or artillery worked on the suspected position. Caution with men did not mean caution with ammunition. That was the trade. And the trade became much more powerful when the problem moved beyond one squad and one hedgerow. The German rifleman could hide from a rifle sight. He could not hide a grid square. American field artillery had spent the interwar years building a system around central fire direction. The important innovation was not a new shell. It was organization. Observers, maps, radios, firing data, and batteries were connected so that fire could be shifted and concentrated far more flexibly than a system in which each gun unit worked mainly from its own local solution. For the infantryman, the consequence was practical. A forward observer did not need to crawl into the hedge and identify every defender. He needed a target location good enough to place fire on the terrain that contained the threat. Once that location entered the fire direction process, the question changed. The old question was, where is the man? The new question was, which patch of ground contains the problem? That is a much easier question to answer in Bocage country. A machine gun may be invisible, but the lane it dominates is visible. A mortar observer may be invisible, but the tree line from which observation must occur can be bounded. A German platoon may disappear into a network of hedges, but the field, bank, crossroads, or reverse slope it has to occupy still exists on a map. American artillery practice increasingly converted those geographic clues into fire missions. One of the most dramatic expressions of this system was time on target, or TOT. The idea was to calculate firing times so shells from separated batteries arrived over the target in a tight window, reducing the warning that normally came from the first round's landing before the full concentration arrived. The exact scale of any mission depended on what guns were available, what communications worked, ammunition, range, and tactical priority. But the underlying effect is what matters here. A hidden position could be struck because its location was probable enough, not because every man inside it had been visually confirmed. That distinction turns camouflage from an all-or-nothing protection into a narrower advantage. It can still prevent aimed small arms fire. It can still help a soldier survive observation. It can still delay a tank crew from identifying the exact firing slit. But once the area is treated as a target, the camouflage pattern cannot make the earth beneath the soldier disappear. Hill 192 outside St. Lo showed how brutal that logic could become. The German 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division defended terrain that favored concealment. The paratroopers were experienced, dug in, and protected by the same kind of broken ground that had frustrated Allied infantry elsewhere in Normandy. American troops of the 2nd Infantry Division did not walk through that defense cheaply. The fighting was severe, and the division paid heavily for the hill. That fact matters because it prevents the story from becoming a myth about one clever doctrine making the battlefield easy. Nothing about the Bocage was easy. Reconnaissance by fire did not remove mines, machine guns, mortar concentrations, or the fear of climbing a hedge without knowing what waited on the other side. Artillery did not guarantee that every defender would be hit. A German soldier deep enough in earth could survive. Communications could fail. Coordinates could be wrong. Ammunition had limits. Infantry still had to occupy the ground afterward. But the American system changed the defender's calculation. A concealed soldier could no longer assume that success at visual concealment would protect him from heavy fire. At Hill 192, American artillery repeatedly struck German positions and likely movement areas. The battle became a contest not only of who could see whom, but of who could keep using the terrain after the other side had begun to saturate it. When the hill finally fell on July 11, 1944, the lesson was not that German camouflage had become worthless. The lesson was that camouflage was only one layer in a larger survival system. If the observer could be suppressed, if likely assembly areas could be shelled, if hedges could be combed before assault troops crossed them, then the value of being visually invisible was reduced at several points at once. This is why the captured German reactions recorded in wartime reports are so revealing. Their confusion was not simply, how did the Americans see us? The deeper confusion was, what information did they have that justified firing here? Inside a doctrine built around concealment, that question feels natural. If the enemy has not identified the position, why is the position receiving accurate or concentrated fire? Inside the American system, the threshold could be lower, because the Americans were often not trying to prove the presence of one man before acting. They were trying to make a dangerous location temporarily unusable. That is a different operational objective. There is another reason this difference could be hard to recognize from inside a foxhole. The visible weapon and the decisive system were often not the same thing. A German soldier might experience the event as a mortar bomb arriving over his hedge. A prisoner might tell an interrogator that nobody had seen the position. A survivor might conclude that American observers possessed some unusual ability to detect camouflage, but the cause could begin much earlier and farther away. A vehicle fires into suspicious vegetation. A rifleman sees movement and reports a direction rather than a man. An observer identifies a likely hedge line. A platoon leader passes a location. A fire direction center converts that location into firing data. Several guns respond. None of those steps requires the final victim to have been visually identified as an individual. The system accumulates partial information until partial information is enough. That is the real conceptual break. German camouflage was designed to defeat recognition. The American fire system increasingly converted probability into action, and probability is much harder to camouflage against. Consider the battlefield from the German side for a moment. The defender's ideal sequence is straightforward. He remains still while the attacker approaches. He chooses the moment to fire. The first burst creates shock. The attacker goes to ground. The defender either shifts position or uses the delay to bring heavier weapons onto the stalled formation. Every part of that sequence depends on initiative remaining with the hidden man. Reconnaissance by fire steals some of that initiative before contact. If bullets are already passing through the hedge, the defender may be forced down before he has selected his target. If a tank shell hits the bank, his firing slit may collapse. If mortar rounds arrive on the reverse slope, an observer may lose the position from which he was supposed to watch the road. Even misses matter because they compress the defender's options. The objective is not always to kill the hidden man with the first burst. Sometimes it is enough to make him stop doing the job his concealment was meant to protect. That job might be observation. It might be controlling a gap. It might be waiting for the perfect flank shot. It might be holding a machine gun until the attacking infantry enters a prepared lane. When fire arrives early, the camouflage still hides the soldier, but it no longer guarantees that he can use the position on his own terms. That difference helps explain a paradox in German wartime interrogation reports. American infantry could appear cautious while the American battlefield system remained violently aggressive. The riflemen did not have to expose themselves merely to satisfy the need for certainty. Tanks, machine guns, mortars, and artillery could test the uncertainty first. This was not free. It depended on ammunition. It depended on transport. It depended on radios and trained observers. It depended on gun crews, maps, firing tables, maintenance, fuel roads, and the ability to move shells forward faster than the batteries consumed them. The method therefore reveals something larger than a difference in infantry technique. It reveals a difference in what each army could afford to treat as expendable. The hidden German defender tried to spend time. The American system tried to spend ammunition. If Germany's camouflage bought 10 more seconds before a soldier was seen, those seconds were valuable only if the attacker needed visual certainty. If the attacker was willing to spend a burst of machine gun fire, a tank round, or an artillery concentration on a place that merely looked dangerous, then some of those seconds could be purchased back with metal. That is why Rommel's observation about Allied artillery and ammunition matters more than any claim about superior eyesight. He wrote of the Allies' great superiority in artillery and their exceptionally large supply of ammunition. From a commander responsible for keeping a front intact under constant pressure, that was not a complaint about marksmanship. It was recognition of a system-level asymmetry. The side that can spend more ammunition can operate with a lower threshold of certainty. It can fire on a suspected position and accept that some shells will land on empty ground. The side that must conserve ammunition has to demand more confidence before it fires. And when the enemy is camouflaged, that difference in certainty becomes a difference in tempo. This also helps correct one of the easiest mistakes to make when telling the story. The mistake is to say that German camouflage worked against the British and failed against the Americans. That is too simple. The camouflage worked against both. It still reduced visual detection. It still made German firing points hard to identify. It still forced American infantry to clear hedgerows at close range, often under fire. American troops were killed by concealed defenders throughout the Normandy campaign. What changed was the number of battlefield functions that depended on seeing the defender first. When a squad uses reconnaissance by fire, concealment has less power over the opening moment. When tanks sweep a hedge before infantry cross it, concealment has less power over the ambush. When an observer can place artillery onto a likely position, concealment has less power over the survival of the position as a whole. Camouflage remains useful, but its protection becomes narrower. That is the difference between defeating a weapon and defeating a system. Schick's patterns were designed against eyes, outlines, shadows, and human recognition. They were excellent answers to those problems. They were never designed to make a hedgerow vanish from a map. They were never designed to prevent an army from deciding that every likely firing point deserved a burst before anyone crossed the field. They were never designed to stop a fire direction network from concentrating shells on a location that had been estimated, rather than visually confirmed. In other words, the camouflage was fighting at the scale of the individual body. The American answer was often operating at the scale of terrain, and terrain cannot hide inside a camouflage smock. The maps are worth lingering on because they reveal how strange the war must have felt to a soldier who measured danger by visibility. A man in a hedge experiences the battlefield in meters. He knows what can see him. He knows where the leaves are thickest. He knows which movement will shake a branch. He knows how much of his face can be exposed before a shape becomes human to someone watching from the opposite field. A fire direction center experiences the same battlefield as coordinates. The hedge is not leaves, it is a line. The reverse slope is not shadow, it is an area. The orchard is not a collection of trunks, it is a target reference. When those two ways of understanding the battlefield meet, the hidden soldier can be tactically excellent and still be in danger for reasons he cannot observe. He can control his silhouette. He cannot control the fact that his position sits beside the only lane leading into a village. He can darken his face. He cannot erase the field boundary that a map and an observer both identify as the likely place for a machine gun. He can wait without moving. He cannot prevent the attacker from deciding that stillness itself is not required evidence. That is why the story is ultimately less about camouflage than about information. How much information does an army need before it acts? The German defensive method tried to raise that requirement. Make the attacker search, make him identify, make him hesitate, turn his need for certainty into time, and turn time into mortar fire. The American method tried to lower the requirement. Do not wait for certainty when the terrain already gives you a useful probability. Fire first. Move under that fire. Let the enemy's reaction add information afterward. Neither principle existed in pure form, and neither side fought every action the same way. British forces also used massive artillery fire. German forces also fired on suspected locations. American units still needed reconnaissance, patrols, prisoners, observation, and close combat. But in the hedgerows, the American willingness and ability to combine speculative fire with a large supporting fire network attacked one of concealment's most valuable products. The delay before the attacker felt justified in shooting. That is the mechanism. And once it becomes visible, many of the German complaints stop sounding mysterious. A prisoner says the Americans fired where nobody had been seen. Of course they did. A hidden position receives artillery even though no patrol reached it. It did not need to be reached. An observer believes his hide was perfect, yet machine gun fire tears through the hedge before he transmits his first correction. The hedge was treated as a threat before the observer became a target. The German soldier interprets these events as failures of concealment because concealment is the tool he is using. The American system interprets them as successes of fire discipline because the location, not the individual, is the thing being acted upon. Two armies can therefore look at the same dead man and tell completely different stories about why he died. There was one later development that pushed this logic even farther, but chronology matters here. The proximity fuse, usually called the VT fuse in wartime use, does not explain the July hedgerow fighting. Its broad use against German ground forces came later, during the winter of 1944. That timing is important because it separates two different ideas. In Normandy, the central problem for the hidden defender was that American fire could be directed onto suspected terrain without visual identification. Later in 1944, the VT fuse made some of that artillery even more dangerous to troops taking shallow cover. The fuse used a radio-based proximity system to detonate the shell above the ground rather than waiting for impact. Instead of fragments spreading from a shell that struck the earth, the burst could send fragments downward from overhead. For soldiers trained to flatten themselves against the ground or use shallow cover, that changed the geometry of survival. But it was an extension of the same larger trend, not the original explanation. First, location became more important than visual identification. Then airburst technology made the consequences of being located even harsher. The distinction keeps the story honest. No single weapon made German camouflage obsolete. No single rifle made American infantry immune to ambush. No artillery technique erased the Bocage. The advantage came from stacking methods that all pushed in the same direction. Semiautomatic rifles made volume easier at small unit level. Machine guns and vehicle weapons could sweep likely cover. Tanks could fire into a hedge before infantry crossed it. Mortars could strike reverse slopes and fields that hid observers. Artillery could be concentrated through a flexible fire direction system. And the supply system could feed enough ammunition forward to make firing on probability practical more often than it would have been for an army living closer to scarcity. The stack mattered more than any single piece. That is why the German camouflage story is so revealing. It shows what happens when a very good solution meets a problem that has been redefined around it. Schick and the German camouflage program asked a serious question. How can a soldier become harder to recognize in the terrain where he must fight? They answered it well. The patterns broke outlines. Reversible garments adapted to season. Helmet covers and smocks reduced the regular shapes that betray a human body. In wooded country and hedgerows, those choices could be deadly. But the American fire system was increasingly asking another question. How much certainty is actually necessary before a dangerous piece of terrain can be suppressed? That question does not cancel camouflage. It changes the battlefield value of camouflage. A hidden rifleman is safest when the enemy needs to see him before shooting. He is less safe when the enemy needs only to know the hedge is a likely firing point. A hidden observer is most valuable when he can watch without provoking fire. He is less valuable when every likely observation point is periodically combed or shelled. A concealed machine gun dominates a lane when the attacker must discover its exact slit. It loses some of that advantage when the whole bank can be hit before the attacker moves. The pattern on the uniform has not changed. The information threshold has. That distinction also keeps the comparison from becoming a national character story. The issue was not that one army was brave and another cautious, or that one group of soldiers understood camouflage and another did not. The decisive contrast in this account is procedural. How quickly a suspected location could be turned into suppressive or destructive fire, and how much ammunition the system could afford to spend before certainty arrived. Return, then, to the German paratrooper beneath the hedge east of St. Lo. Do not imagine him as careless. Imagine the opposite. He has chosen the shadowed side of the bank. He has broken the shape of his helmet. He has kept his movements small. The splinter pattern across his smock does what it was designed to do. An American rifleman looking directly toward the hedge may still fail to separate cloth from leaves. The German's training has not betrayed him. His camouflage has not betrayed him. What has changed is the chain of decisions on the other side. The American observer does not need to say, "I see a man." He can say, in effect, "That hedge is where the fire is coming from," or "That bank is the likely position," or simply pass a location dangerous enough to justify suppression. The map accepts that information even when the eye cannot complete it. A firing unit accepts the map. The rounds accept the coordinates, and the German soldier experiences the result as something almost supernatural because the steps that condemned his position happened outside his field of view. He sees no scout. He sees no rifle pointed at him. He hears no shout that he has been spotted. Then the ground around him erupts. From his perspective, death has arrived before detection. From the American system's perspective, detection was never the required step. Location was enough. That is the most useful way to understand the apparent mystery in the prisoner reports. The Germans were not confronting men with better eyes. They were confronting an army that could often act on less visual certainty because it possessed the weapons, communications, doctrine, and ammunition to turn suspicion into fire. The result should not be romanticized. American units still suffered. German defenders still killed men from positions no one had seen. Artillery still missed. Hedgerows still had to be crossed one field at a time. The Bocage remained one of the most difficult environments an infantryman could enter. But the relationship between concealment and safety had changed. The German soldier had mastered the art of making himself difficult to recognize. The Americans increasingly answered by making recognition less necessary. A camouflage pattern can hide a man from an eye. It cannot hide the ground that must hold him. Camouflage had defeated the eye. It had not defeated the grid.